Ivan Andreevich Belov, whom everyone called Raven behind his back, and even to his face, sat on a low stump carved from cedar, propping his heavy chin with his broad palm.
The morning sun did not reach his winter hut, hidden in a deep ravine between the mountains. Here, in the realm of moss and pine needles, there was always twilight and the smell of damp earth, which Crow liked. Only here, far from what he called asphalt justice, could he find peace. At his feet, curled up in a tight grey ball, lay Shadow, his West Siberian Laika, his faithful, silent companion. She was not asleep, but simply waiting, as always, for her master to finally stop staring at the smoldering embers of the fire and make a decision. He was not thinking about the meaning of life or the distant problems of the city, which he had been avoiding for almost 10 years. His thoughts were occupied with gathering herbs for tinctures and checking the snares set for small game. Life, reduced to the essentials, was simple and honest. He was not looking for heroes or villains, he was only looking for balance. But balance was always fragile, and it was usually disrupted by the phone, a ridiculous, alien thing that Raven kept charged for only one person. The phone, hidden under a piece of tarpaulin, vibrated briefly and insistently. Voron grimaced, as if he had been tugged at a long-healed but sensitive scar. He picked up the phone without looking at the display. On the other end of the line was Major Petrov, an investigator from the regional center. Their relationship was not friendly. Rather, it resembled a forced symbiosis between a predator and a scavenger. Petrov needed Raven's eyes and intuition where the maps ended and the real taiga began. And Raven used this to restore his natural order, without regard for bureaucratic procedures. Voron. Petrov's voice was thick, hoarse, and very anxious. It lacked its usual authoritative tone, which meant only one thing. Things were bad. Very bad. Listening. Ivan Andreevich's low, hoarse voice seemed to come not from his throat, but directly from the ground, from its very roots. He spoke little and did not like to waste words on greetings. A group of tourists, 4 of them, found them half an hour ago, near the Saganovsky swamps, almost frozen, dehydrated. Managed to get them out somehow. Voron waited. He knew that wasn't the whole story. If it were just a case of people getting lost, Petrov wouldn't have called him. The guide. Semenov, an old tiger man, a local. He's gone. He ran away. Petrov exhaled into the receiver, as if pushing away an invisible weight. Ran away? Semenov? Voron closed his eyes. He knew the guide's name. Anatoly Semenov, reliable as a rock. A guide who had been going into the taiga since he was 15. He could have made a mistake in his calculations, but he couldn't panic. It was against his very nature, against the laws of the forest, which he knew as well as Voron did. What do the survivors say? That's where it gets strange, Vanya. There are 3 of them, 2 men and a woman. The 4th, another man, died of hypothermia in the helicopter. The survivors are like carbon copies of each other. Their statements are too clean. They say that Semenov first rushed around, then simply threw down his backpack, shouted something about a cursed place, and rushed into the depths of the swamp. In a panic, the Raven, who had heard hundreds of stories about panic in his life, did not feel a shadow of doubt. Lies. Panic has its own uneven rhythm. People in panic either remain silent or shout chaotically. their stories full of fragmented details and emotional outbursts. Too clean a testimony is like perfectly ironed clothes on a person who has just spent a week in a swamp.
"They're lying, Petrov," Voron stated. There was no accusation in his voice, only grim certainty. "I know. I can feel it." Petrov hesitated. "But how can we prove it? All three of them are city dwellers, influential."
"The lawyers will arrive before we find Semenov. And without a body, Sis' disappearance will simply be attributed to a breakdown on their part." "The place. Describe the place." "The edge of the Saganov swamps. Black water. Peat. They set up camp in an old spruce forest right at the edge. This is no place for panic, Voron. This is a place for murder."
Ivan Andreevich stood up. The rock that he was seemed to come to life, and his tall, sinewy figure straightened.
The shadow instantly raised its head, its golden eyes fixed on its master, waiting for a command. Laika sensed the change in mood, the hunting note that suddenly sounded in the silence. "You've already made up your mind, Petrov. You didn't call to ask, you called to summon."
Voron took his old, well-used knife, checked its sharpness with his thumb, his expression unchanged. "I need the truth, Vanya. The one that's left in the mud. The one that no lawyer can wash away."
"I'll send you the coordinates. Tomorrow morning, as soon as the helicopter can land."
"No. I'll leave now. I'll be there by morning."
Voron looked at the sun, which already promised a hot, humid day. "You said it yourself. It's a swamp. The faster, the fewer traces." Voron hung up without saying goodbye. He quickly gathered his equipment without unnecessary movements. Minimum food, maximum functionality. An axe, binoculars, dry clothes, a first aid kit. His world was not city offices. His territory was the endless, indifferent expanse of the taiga, where the laws were dictated by cold, hunger, and fear. The crime that had taken place there smelled not of perfume and money, but of damp earth and despair. For Voron, this was not just an investigation. He knew how wild nature tests a person. He knew that when the civilized facade collapses, the true animal essence comes out. And if Semenov, the guide, really did run away, then he betrayed his main duty, violating the unspoken law of the taiga. But if Semenov had been forced to disappear, it was a far more serious crime than mere murder. It was a violation of order, and Voron considered it his sole task to restore it by removing the sick individual from the ecosystem. He had to understand not the logic of murder, but the logic of survival. How hunger, cold, and fear change people, turning them from a group of comrades into a pack of predators, where the most dangerous is the one who remains the most cold-blooded. And the perfect, too clean, lies of the survivors only meant that there was someone among them who had not only survived hell, but also used it as a cover for their own chilling plan. "Shadow," Raven called quietly. Laika jumped up, her tail hitting the ground with a short thud. "Get to work, girl. We're looking for lies. We're looking for Semenov's shadow." He stepped out of the winter hut. Sunlight, finally breaking through the branches, fell on his face, on wrinkles as hard as riverbeds, on thick gray hair. The most remarkable thing about him was his gaze, heavy, calm, and incredibly attentive, like that of a bird of prey. He behaved as if it were not he who was leaving the taiga,
but the tiger that was drawing him back, welcoming its rightful master. With every step away from the winter hut, he became more and more like his nickname, the Raven, who had flown to a place where something wrong had just happened, something that had disturbed the delicate balance between life and death.
He did not hurry, but moved with unyielding determination. He didn't need helicopters. He himself was part of the taiga, and it was waiting for him.
Ivan Andreevich Belov reached the edge of the Saganovskoye swamp just as the sky was beginning to lighten above the spruce forest, casting only a faint ghostly light on the black water. He walked without haste, but with such purpose that the shadow, walking slightly ahead, did not even look back, completely trusting the chosen course. The road from the winter hut took them 7 hours, and Raven used every meter of the way to tune his inner tuning fork. The hustle and bustle of the city, Petrov's anxiety, the imposed version of panic. All this was cut off, leaving room only for the pure perception of the taiga. The place that the police called a camp was actually a small, barely accessible island formed by old moss-covered fir trees that had managed to cling with their roots to the dense peat at the edge of the bog. This island had already been virtually destroyed. A dozen steps taken by inexperienced feet in canvas boots and gaiters turned the thin covering of moss, grass, and mud into a mess that would inevitably be washed away by water in a few hours. The Raven stopped, feeling the familiar, quiet contempt for the carelessness of asphalt justice. He saw how the police, rescuers, and possibly medical workers trying to work quickly erased the thinnest but most important layer of information. The shadow froze nearby, pressing against his leg, and growled quietly. Not at the people, but at the disturbed order. Major Petrov stood a little to the side, wrapped in his government-issued pea coat, despite the lack of severe cold, and looked as if he himself were stuck somewhere between land and black water. Seeing Voron, he took a step toward him, but stopped when he saw the expression on his face. "Voron, you," Petrov began. "You trampled everything yourself, Petrov," Ivan Andreevich said quietly, but with such force that Petrov felt as if he had been struck in the ear. "Everything was here, and now there are only your boots. We worked according to protocol. We saved people. One has already died. We don't have a week in the mud. I have 15 minutes to figure out what happened here, and you won't get in my way." Voron waved the investigator away like an annoying mosquito. He began working with what had not yet been completely destroyed, the edge of the swamp, where the soil was so wet that it had preserved the footprints despite the passage of time. Voron did not look at what people had left behind. He looked at how these traces lay, how they interacted with the grass, moss, and peat water. He moved slowly, but unhurriedly, as if he himself were a shadow gliding along the border between life and death. The first thing that caught his attention was the remains of a campfire. It was flooded with water, but Raven picked up a few charred logs. They had not been simply thrown away, but stacked for maximum heat transfer. This was not the work of a panicker, but of a person who, even in a desperate situation, had kept a clear head. The second thing was the place where the tent had stood. It had been folded carelessly, but not torn, as happens in a fit of fear. Moreover, under it, Raven found several small branches, deliberately placed on the ground to provide minimal insulation from the cold. Again, deliberation, not chaos. Then Raven turned his attention to the area from which, according to the survivors, the guide Semenov had fled. All three, in their testimony, unanimously pointed to a narrow path
leading to the deepest part of the swamp. Into the thicket.
Crouching over the ground, Voron first saw disorderly footprints confirming the panic theory. Deep, jagged steps, as if the man had been running without looking where he was going.
But then, taking 2 steps back and using binoculars to focus on the far side, he noticed an anomaly. Where, in theory, the broken tracks leading into the swamp should have continued, completely different footprints were visible. Deep, but surprisingly even and clear tracks that lay strictly between the hummocks, bypassing the most boggy places. These were the footsteps of a guide who knew the area better than his own home. But these were not the footsteps of a panicked man. These were the footsteps of a man who was walking purposefully and cautiously, trying not to leave any traces other than those that imitated chaos. The guy did not run in panic. He left so that he could be found on this trail. And someone really wanted this version to be considered the truth. They didn't find a backpack or a knife. They found traces that were supposed to convince us, whispered Raven. And Shadow, realizing that this was serious, sniffed the ground, committing the smell of lies to memory. What did you find? Petrov came closer, his face expressing a mixture of irritation and hope. I found a script, not a story, but a script. Raven stood up, his gaze heavy as granite. Take me to them, now. Not to the hospital, to the base, where they will feel safe and behave like victims. Investigator Petrov got the hint. Voron needed to see them playing their roles, not suffering. He drove Voron to a city hotel, where the survivors had been placed before their relatives could pick them up. It was the perfect place. They had already received medical attention. They felt safe. And now their emotions were pure, either genuine shock or well-rehearsed lies. Voron entered the lounge, which looked more like an interrogation room than a sitting area. There were 3 people there. Victor, a heavy-set, pale man in his 40s, who sat with his head in his hands, shivering even in the warm room. Eleanor, a young woman with a beautiful face swollen from crying, who stared fixedly at one point. And Arkady, the youngest of them, about 30 years old, who maintained a composure unnatural for someone who had experienced such horror. Arkady drank hot tea in small, restrained sips and neatly folded his napkins. It was him that Voron immediately paid special attention to. I am Ivan Andreevich. Voron did not introduce himself. He simply stated the fact of his presence, his low, hoarse voice filling the small space. He sat down in a chair opposite them, not blinking, not averting his heavy gaze. A shadow fell silently at his feet, like a statue. Major Petrov told us about your statements. They match. That's good. Voron spoke slowly, deceptively calmly. But they don't explain the main thing. Why Semenov? Victor, who had been silent until then, shuddered. I told you. He went crazy. He shouted that we would all die, that the swamp wouldn't let us out. Voron looked at him. Victor was a hysterical type, a man who would easily succumb to panic, but would hardly be able to organize it. His fear was real, animalistic, but too superficial, as if he was afraid not of what had happened, but of what might happen if he didn't tremble convincingly enough. Panic has a smell, Victor. You don't smell like panic, Semenov. You smell like relief. Elena raised her head. Her eyes were dry, despite the traces of tears. We're glad you found us. That's natural. We thought we were going to die there,
Elena was an observer. She said the right things. Her facial expressions were flawless. Shock, pain, relief. But Voron noticed how she clenched her hands into fists under the table. Not out of fear, but out of control. She was afraid not of losing her life, but of losing the thread of the story they had all made up together. You said he ran deep into the swamp. Raven looked at Arkady, who continued to drink his tea. Are you sure, Arkady? Into the deepest part?
Arkady put down his cup, and this small, restrained gesture was louder than Victor's cry. Yes. We tried to stop him, but he was like a wild animal. He was broken. I've seen people break. Arkady was cold-blooded. He didn't tremble, cry, or rush about. He analyzed. He used the word broken, which gave him away. He didn't describe panic. He gave a diagnosis. And you didn't hear any screams? Gunshots? Nothing? Voron asked slowly, almost hypnotically. No. He just disappeared. The tiger took him. Arkady met Voron's gaze for the first time, and his eyes flashed with calculation rather than emotion. He waited for the next question, ready for any turn. Raven suddenly changed the subject, ignoring the official version. What have you been eating for the last 3 days? Arkady faltered for a second, and it was the first tiny crack. Well, leftovers, crackers, porridge. What porridge? You threw away all the heavy stuff. I don't remember. I was so exhausted. Victor, delighted that the attention had shifted, quickly chimed in. We shared everything, honestly. I gave away my last piece. We somehow held on. For the sake of... Voron ignored Victor again, returning to Arkady, but without words. He just looked at him. This gaze, the raven's gaze, did not judge. It simply saw through. He saw that Arkady was holding up better than anyone else. Too well. His lips were not chapped, his hands were not scratched like the others. And his story was not just clean. It was polished. The raven understood. Semenov hadn't escaped. He had become expendable. And the cold-blooded man that Arkady was took advantage of the general panic and hopelessness to create the perfect cover. He had eliminated the only one who could lead them out, and remained the only one in control of the situation. The other two, Victor and Elena, were too frightened or too broken to remember what had happened, and now simply followed Arkady's instructions, who had skillfully instilled a common story in them. Ivan Andreevich stood up. He nodded to Petrov, who was anxiously watching the silent confrontation, and left. Where are you going? Petrov asked. To reconstruct the chronology, Voron replied. The tiger doesn't lie. The truth always remains in the fire. He left the survivors with their clean, polished alibi. As he left, their eyes showed not relief, but fear, not of the law, but of the man who had seen their true, animalistic nature. Voron knew that the dirtiest job awaited him, analyzing how people cross the line when their civilized minds die. His path now lay back to the remains of the campfire, to find that very key moment when the group of tourists turned into a pack of predators, and when one of them, the strongest in spirit, decided that he was the new leader. Raven returned to the edge of the swamp, where Major Petrov and a couple of forensic scientists were waiting for him, looking ridiculous in their clean white overalls amid the mud and moss. The sun was already high in the sky, and the swamp breathed a thick, heavy haze that could hide, or conversely, distort the truth. Ivan Andreevich paid no attention to the commotion. For him, city procedures were meaningless. His method required silence and the ability to see through time. He began on the first day of the hike, mentally tracing the path they had taken, based on the rare but clear prints of hiking boots found in drier areas of the forest, before the group got stuck in the wet soil. Voron was reconstructing not just the route, but the energy map of the group. In the early days, the tracks were wide and the steps springy, indicating high motivation and reserves of strength. The backpacks were full, the gait confident. They walked as a team. The transition to the moment when the group lost its way was marked by a sudden narrowing of steps, frequent stops, and chaotic avoidance of obstacles. This happened on about the 5th day. Semenov must have realized his mistake, but did not admit it immediately. From this moment on, the psychology of isolation begins. Voron returned to the camp where the tourists had been before the evacuation and focused on the most important things for survival: food and warmth. It was here, in the discarded trifles, that the true chronology of despair lay hidden. He ignored the tent and sleeping bags, which had been simply thrown away, and knelt down by the ashes. There were no food scraps, no candy wrappers, no crumbs, not even a hint of plastic packaging. It was unnaturally clean. In the wild, when supplies run out, people become messy and careless, throwing trash away in a panic. Here, however, someone had obviously cleaned up thoroughly. This was the first indisputable proof that Arkady, cold-blooded, was not just surviving, but was in control of the situation and had covered his tracks before they were found. The raven began sifting through the ashes with his hands, ignoring the disgusted looks of the detectives. He was looking not for what had been eaten, but for what had been eaten. And soon his fingers found something hard, not of organic origin. They were tiny, melted pieces of aluminum foil, and tiny, almost microscopic bones. He picked them up and showed them to Petrov. "These are bones," Voron said in a low voice. "Not from large game. Probably from a small rodent, or, more likely, a chipmunk. And this," he pointed to the foil, "is not from a tourist's rations. This is foil that is often used to wrap chocolate. Very expensive, very bitter chocolate." Petrov frowned. "So what? A chipmunk? That's normal when you're hungry." "Normal," agreed Raven. "But even if you manage to catch a chipmunk, you don't cut it up and cook it in foil. You roast it on a stick. And foil means that someone tried to preserve the fat and make the most of every crumb. Using foil to cook game caught in desperation is not just hunger. It is extreme hunger, mixed with calculation, and an attempt to cover up the traces. Tourists usually despise chipmunks until they start dying. And they wouldn't have cleaned up the camp so thoroughly after such a sudden panic. The raven continued his reconstruction. From the tracks left on the ground and the way the branches were cut, too neat for a person in the final stages of exhaustion, he reconstructed the chronology of deprivation. Day 1, delusion. The group is holding together. There is water. There is plenty of food. Laughter. Conversation. Hope. Day 5. Despair. Food is running out.
Tents are pitched carelessly. The tracks indicate quarrels. The tracks of two people diverge and converge again. Semenov tries to find a way out. Day 7. Turning point. Real cold and wet snow. This is evident from the thick layers of pine needles that people brought into the tent to keep warm, which was not the case on previous nights. All food is gone. It is at this moment that the group transitions from a state of together to a state of every man for himself. Semenov loses his authority. Day 8. Taboo breach. Traces of small game hunting and chipmunk bones are found. Voron calls this day Beast Day. The human mind gives way to instincts. Day 9. Scenario. The guide disappears. Arkady and his accomplices claim that Semenov snapped yesterday on the 9th day, explained Raven. But they had been hungry predators for 2 days before that. 2 days during which they shared one small portion of meat. So the conflict started over food. Petrov hunched his shoulders. The conflict started over power, Petrov. Food was just a tool. Semenov was the only one who could lead them out. He was the last thread connecting them to civilization. When hunger turned them into beasts, someone realized that the only guarantee of survival was control over those who were even weaker, and the elimination of the only one who could stand in his way. Voron picked up a piece of rusty, thin metal that Shadow had dug out from under the wet moss, a few feet from the ashes. Look at this piece. He handed Petrov the fragment. It's part of a can opener. Very old, broken. It didn't belong to Semenov. He had a good folding knife. The tourist could have broken it. No, Voron cut him off. The tourists I saw in the throes of hunger clung to every tool they had. Would they have just thrown away a broken knife? No. They would have tried to use it until the very end. And this knife was broken on purpose. But that's not the main thing. He dropped the fragment back into the mud and pointed to another detail that only Shadow must have seen. At the edge of a fallen spruce tree, where someone must have been sitting, waiting for their fate, Raven discovered a tiny, barely noticeable, perfectly round imprint. It was not pressed into the mud, but into the trunk of an old, damp spruce tree. Do you see that, Petrov? Raven almost growled rather than spoke. That's not a mark from a branch. It's a mark from a ring, an expensive one. And someone with a ring on their finger sat here for a very long time, very nervously. A ring with a deep notch imprinted in the soft resin of the tree from constant squeezing of the hand. Voron remembered Arkady, young, cool-headed, sipping tea in small sips, keeping his hands under the table. Was he married? Engaged? Voron didn't see a ring on his finger, but he saw him clench his fists. The turning point, Petrov, came when the food ran out, but hope did not. Semenov was killed, or incapacitated, before he was officially written off as panicking, concluded the Raven. And the ring belongs to someone who was rich enough to wear it, and cold-blooded enough to take it off when he realized that his animal side had come out. It was Arkady. Ivan Andreevich stood up to his full height, his gaze piercing the dark thicket like the beams of a searchlight. He did not find the body, but he found evidence of murder based on the most ancient and indisputable laws, the laws of hunger and fear. Semenov had been eliminated, not out of malice, but out of pure calculation, and now Voron had to find out where this last conductor had gone.
who perhaps was trying to save not himself, but the truth that Arkady was now so diligently covering up.
Gather everything, the ring and the bones, but don't tell Arkady what I found. He must think that I'm still looking for traces of his panicked escape.
Voron ordered, picking up his backpack.
He and Shadow left the trampled camp, but not following the traces of the escape, but their own new traces, heading for places that Semenov would most likely have used as a hideout, rather than a place for a panicked suicide.
Voron felt that his work here, in this rotting peat hell, was just beginning. The truth was as cold as the water in the swamp, and no less deadly.
Voron walked along the narrow path
Where, according to the survivors, Anatoly Semenov had fallen in a mad panic. He didn't look at his feet, but felt every inch of ground beneath his heavy, sturdy boots.
The path, created to mislead, did not lead deep into the swamp, where death comes quickly, but along the edge, to a place where a person can hide, but cannot disappear without a trace. This confirmed the idea. They did not want to bury Semenov in the swamp. They wanted to lose him by staging an accident.
Ivan Andreevich knew that any guide, even one who had lost his mind, would first grab what was most important to him.
For Semenov, it was his old, well-used hunting knife, which always hung on his belt, and his personal, lightweight backpack, where he kept matches in a waterproof case, a piece of bacon, and a compass. These were the things that made the taiga man feel safe, even in the middle of hell. According to Arkady, Semenov simply dropped his large expedition backpack, which he was carrying for the tourists, and ran off. But where was his personal equipment?
The Raven stopped at an old, half-submerged pine tree, whose roots clung to the shore like claws. He stroked Shadow's coarse fur. Search, girl. Search for his scent.
Search for what was discarded, never to be found.
Shadow, whose sense of smell was more accurate than any instrument, immediately set to work.
She did not run along the trail,
but methodically sniffed the soil, moss, and water, moving not with the logic of a panicked escape, but with the logic of denial.
She was looking for a foreign element, a scent that had been here briefly and had been deliberately disguised. Soon the dog stopped. She did not bark, but simply froze, crouching on her hind legs near a thicket of bog rosemary, and whimpered quietly, burying her nose in the ground. The raven approached. The bog rosemary branch had been broken unnaturally, not by an animal or the wind, but by a precise, powerful blow. This spot had not been chosen at random. It marked the beginning of a more viscous, impassable area, and whatever was to be hidden would easily sink into the peat. The raven carefully parted the thickets, working only with his fingertips. He smelled a strong, musty odor coming from the swamp, mixed with the smell of wet leather and metal.
First, he found a small leather knife sheath. It was empty. Semenov had obviously taken the knife with him. But why did he remove the sheath?
In a panic, people don't engage in such pedantry. They pull out their weapons, tear the fabric, but don't remove the case. This was an action taken after the conflict, when the person had already realized the danger and was preparing to defend himself, or when he was being disarmed. Then the shadow pulled something larger out from under the roots, a piece of rubberized fabric. It was Semenov's small backpack. It had been cut open, not torn, but with a sharp blade, along the seam. There was nothing inside. No matches, no compass, no lard.
But all these items, necessary for survival, could not have disappeared without a trace. Voron carefully examined the backpack. It had been emptied not to take the contents, but to ensure that the contents would not be used. Semenov, if he had escaped, would have taken the matches and the knife.
If he had been killed immediately, the killer would not have wasted time destroying the backpack. So there had been a conflict, as a result of which the guide had been disarmed and deprived of his means, and then his escape had been staged. But what was destroyed intentionally? Voron plunged his hand back into the mud, working like an archaeologist, searching for the truth beneath layers of centuries and lies. He felt something elastic and dense, unlike a root. He pulled it out. It was a piece of a satellite phone, not a cheap one, but an old, reliable device used by taiga workers. The phone wasn't just broken, it had been crushed by a heavy object. The screen was smashed, the case cracked, and the battery was missing. The Raven clutched the fragment in his hand. There it was, the key element of the staged scene. If Semenov had fled in panic, he would not have thought about the satellite phone. If he had been killed in a fight, the phone would most likely have remained intact and simply been drowned, but it had been destroyed in such a way as to rule out any possibility of communication with the outside world, any possibility of sending an alarm signal or a message about what had happened. They didn't want him to escape. They wanted him to be silent, Voron whispered to Tenny. He understood that Arkady, the most cold-blooded, knew that a guide was not just a man with a map, but a man with connections. And as long as those connections existed, there would be no control over the group. Ivan Andreevich continued his search, moving 30 meters away from the discarded backpack. He knew that whoever had covered up the tracks must have gotten rid of other, heavier pieces of evidence that couldn't be carried away. The shadow signaled again, this time at a tall, thick bush of black elderberry. Raven crawled under the bush. The soil here was drier, and under a layer of fresh moss, which had clearly been moved by someone, he found another backpack. It was a large expedition backpack, one of those belonging to tourists. It was heavy. The backpack had not been taken off. It had been deliberately buried and camouflaged. Raven pulled it out. The weight was unusual. Inside, he found not only the remains of food that could have fed the group for another couple of days, which contradicted the testimony about extreme hunger, but also something completely different. There were hiking boots neatly folded, belonging, judging by their size, to the fourth tourist, the one who died of hypothermia in the helicopter. Next to the boots was a small metal box with a lock, used to transport valuable and fragile items, such as professional photographic equipment or expensive gadgets. And this box was empty. The lock had been carefully picked or opened with a key, not broken in a panic. Voron connected the facts. First, the guide had no personal belongings that he would have taken in a panic. Knife, matches, and his satellite phone was destroyed. Second, the group had food supplies, which they lied about. Third, one of the tourists' backpacks was buried, and inside it was a metal box, broken into not in desperation, but with calculation. Fourth, all three witnesses saw Semenov running off in a mad panic, but their testimonies are equally clean. It's not panic, Petrov, Voron muttered to himself, brushing the dirt off his hands. It's substitution. They replaced theft and possibly murder with natural selection. They staged Semenov's breakdown from fear and hunger to hide the fact that Semenov was eliminated as a witness and a hindrance. Ivan Andreevich put down his backpack. Now he was only interested in trail number 3. Arkady,
the most cold-blooded. He wasn't just surviving, he was clearing his path, and that path lay through the death of others and their property. But where had Semenov gone?
If he wasn't drowned in the swamp right away, then he was taken away. Why?
Voron, not wanting to go deeper into the swamp, turned around and followed the trail that he believed to be the real escape route.
He was not looking for traces of flight, but traces of force, traces of struggle, traces of dragging, traces of a person being led against their will.
The tracks have been covered up, he said, turning to Shadow.
Now we're looking for what couldn't be covered up, and that lies deeper than the mud. He left the thicket, leaving behind the staged trail. His piercing, attentive gaze was now fixed on the only dried trail that led away from the swamp, and had not been mentioned by any of the survivors. It was there, in the denser soil, that the true traces might have been preserved. Raven knew that he had a long way to go to read not the words, but the gait of these people. And in that gait he would see which of them were victims and which were predators. Ivan Andreevich returned to the edge of the forest, leaving behind the mud of the swamp, saturated with lies. He was not interested in the last chaotic steps of the group, but in the first, clear prints made on relatively dry, compacted ground at the very beginning of the path. He knew that it was there, in the gait of a person who does not yet suspect his imminent demise, that his true nature and his place in the pack were revealed. The taiga preserves not only the traces of facts, but also of intentions. The raven moved slowly, his old eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the thicket, gliding over the ground, reading every dent, every displaced pebble, every broken blade of grass, like a page from an ancient, merciless book. Close behind, like a shadow, followed shadow, her soft paws stepping precisely in her master's footsteps.
On the hard ground, where the group had walked for the first 2 days, Raven clearly identified 4 different gait patterns, 4 different destinies recorded in the earth.
Footprint number 1, the widest and most sloppy, belonged to Victor. Hysterical. The footprint was deep at the heel and slanted toward the outside of the foot. This is the gait of a city person who tries to overcome insecurity by taking overly long strides. Too much swing, too sharp a landing. Such people are aggressive and assertive in everyday life, but in conditions of real danger, they quickly lose their center of gravity and are the first to panic. His footprint was that of someone who would suffer the greatest physical and psychological loss. Footprint number 2 was heavy, with uneven pressure on the ground and a dragging toe, as if the person was carrying not only their backpack, but also an invisible load of fatigue. It was the gait of Elena, the observer, a woman who went hiking without sufficient physical training, but compensated for it with willpower. Her footprints spoke of chronic fatigue that had set in much earlier than she tried to show. At the end of the journey, when hunger and cold took their toll, a person with such footprints becomes a burden, unable to resist, and forced to agree with any decision made by the leader. She was ready to accept someone else's lies just to survive. Trail number 4 was the trail of the guide himself, Semenov. At the beginning of the journey, it was perfect, even, deep, confident, with precise knowledge of where to place each foot. Ha!
This was the footprint of the master of the taiga. But Ivan Andreevich focused on the barely noticeable prints that belonged to Semenov, but were made on the way back, when, according to the survivors, he ran in a mad panic to the swamp.
On dry ground, these tracks did not look like the ragged steps of a panicked man, but like an unusually sliding step. There was no heel strike, no forward jump. The step was surprisingly cautious, as if the man was trying not to leave any traces, or it was painful for him to step with his whole foot. The guide was not running. The guide was either being escorted or was injured and trying to walk silently. This sliding footprint was the final confirmation for Voron. The panic theory was a lie invented to divert attention. But the most important and most disturbing was footprint number 3, belonging to Arkady. Voron stopped, crouched down, and studied it carefully. Arkady, the youngest and physically strongest of the group, should have left the deepest and most powerful footprint, characteristic of a person who carries his weight effortlessly. However, his footprint was surprisingly light. The pressure on the ground was evenly distributed across the entire sole, with no emphasis on the heel or toe. It did not resemble the gait of a tired person, because a tired person's legs trip and their steps become uneven. It was the gait of a person who controls every muscle, constantly conserving energy, trying to appear lighter and smaller than he really is. Judging by his footprints, Arkady did not participate in the general relaxation of the first few days. He did not waste energy on empty talk and Victor's long strides. He was conserving his energy. He was physically removed from the group from the very beginning, and his body, his gait, was already preparing for a long confrontation. These were not the tracks of a tourist, but of a predator lying in wait, waiting for its prey to weaken. The raven rose. He now knew which of them was the most cold-blooded. It was not the one who shouted, Victor, or the one who cried quietly, Elena, but the one who behaved in comfortable conditions as if in war. Arkady, trail number 3, was the one who was least affected by hunger and cold, because his psychology was initially geared toward survival at any cost. He did not break. He grew stronger. Ivan Andreevich walked a few hundred meters ahead, following Arkady's tracks. He saw how his tracks changed every day, while Victor and Elena's tracks became increasingly uneven and deep due to fatigue and excess weight. Arkady's tracks remained even. He did not speed up or slow down. He maintained a perfect, monotonous rhythm. It was not just physical effort. It was a manifestation of willpower. He did not feel fear. He used it as fuel. In one of the areas where the group had apparently stopped for a rest, Voron discovered another, smaller but crucial detail. Hidden under a thick pine root, where none of the investigators would have looked, he found something that had fallen off a shoe. It was a piece of dried clay, mixed with something oily and bright green. Ivan Andreevich knew what it was. The remains of a special foot ointment used by professional athletes or hunters to protect against chafing and moisture. Ordinary tourists, like Victor and Elena, would have used talcum powder or simple creams. But Arkady, unlike them, was prepared for a long, difficult journey. And he used this ointment secretly, not sharing it with the others, which was entirely in keeping with his secretive, egocentric nature. Voron's thoughts became philosophical. He saw how deprivation awakened the animal in people. But in Arkady, it was not an awakening, but a conscious choice. He was the most civilized of them, but it was civilization that gave him the opportunity to consciously cross the line. He used his knowledge to preserve himself, while others collapsed from hunger and fear. "He didn't go mad," muttered Voron. "He showed perfect reason in savage conditions, and that makes him the most dangerous."
Ivan Andreevich returned to the place where the four tracks had merged into a single chaos of the last few days. Now he knew that it was Arkady, with his light, controlled step, who had directed the destruction of the evidence and the development of a clean version. He was not just a survivor. He was the director of the whole drama.
Next, Voron had to find not a motive, but evidence linking Arkady directly to Semenov's disappearance. He had to understand how Arkady, using panic as a smokescreen, was able to eliminate the only person who knew the taiga better than anyone else.
His path now lay not toward the traces, but toward the secret of the guide himself. To understand what made him, a man of his word and honor, become an easy target. Voron and Shadow left behind traces that told them everything about the weaknesses and strengths of the group.
The taiga, like an old notary, kept the truth in the smallest details, and Raven was the only one who could decipher this merciless handwriting. He knew that the truth about Semenov lay not in the swamp, but in what he had tried to hide from his tourists, even before they got lost. Voron left the taiga, but he did not leave it behind. Even on the road, traveling in Petrov's old UAZ, which struggled to cope with the broken country road, his attention was focused not on the dust and bumps, but on the rhythm. Semyonov's disrupted rhythm. He knew that the Taiga Man, a man of honor, could not have run away. So the reason for his disappearance was not hunger, but something that had been brought into the forest from outside, from the very world that Raven despised. The village where Anatoly Semenov lived was a small, closed world where everyone knew everything about everyone else. It stood on the banks of a mountain river where life flowed according to its own unhurried laws, far from the hustle and bustle of big cities. Voron was not looking for condolences. He was looking for conflict. First, he headed for Semenov's house. The house was sturdy and well kept, but with a touch of quiet, rural poverty. The conductor's wife, Maria, was a woman of about 45, with a face furrowed with worry. She did not cry, but her eyes were dry and empty, as if she had already gone through all the grief and was left only with the expectation of the inevitable. "You don't believe Tolia ran away, do you?" It wasn't a question, but a statement that slipped from her lips as soon as Voron entered. She immediately understood who was standing in front of her, even though she was probably seeing him for the first time. She saw the look in his eyes. "I believe the tracks, Maria. And they say that your husband didn't leave in a panic." He left so that they would find him, or so that they wouldn't find him, but would believe that he had run away. Voron's low, hoarse voice sounded reassuring but gave no hope. She brought out some old crumpled papers. It turned out that Semenov had taken out a large loan, by the village's standards, shortly before the trip. The debt was not for anything specific, but simply to tie up loose ends. He was constantly in debt, but he never lost heart. The tiger fed him. Maria ran her hand over the papers, but this time he was restless. Like before a storm, he said this trip would be his last, that he would settle everything. The amount was large,
Almost 700,000 rubles.
700,000 rubles isn't the kind of money that tourists would kill for, but it's the kind of money that could be used to blackmail a man of honor like Semenov. Who did he go with? Voron asked, ignoring the financial aspect. A group, 4 people. He said they were some kind of investors, gold prospectors. They want to see the old abandoned sites. I was surprised. He never took people along these trails. Maria looked up at him, and a guess flashed in her eyes. He said that one of them, Arkady, is very persistent, pays double for confidentiality. Voron felt the tension inside him tighten. Arkady, trail number 3, cold-blooded, skilled at covering his tracks, wearing an expensive ring. Investor, gold, tiger. It was a classic breach of order, when greed and secret deals collide with the law of the forest. Voron went to his neighbors. Old hunter Uncle Grisha was sitting on a bench, cleaning his gun, paying no attention to the commotion.
Semenov?
He didn't run away. Talik isn't like that, said Uncle Grisha without looking up. But here's what I'll say. The day before the trip, a car came here, an expensive one, a city car. Semenov and the man talked for a long time, loudly. What did they say? I didn't hear. But that man, he wasn't one of the gangsters. He was one of those who was used to giving orders. He was wearing a suit, clean, and he had something in his hands. Not a gun, but something long, wrapped in tarpaulin. He handed it to Tolek, and Semenov took it, reluctantly, as if it were a hot coal. What was it? I don't know. Uncle Grisha finally looked up, and his eyes, accustomed to seeing far, fixed on Voron. But then Tolek went into the house, and half an hour later he came out, white as that tarpaulin. He said to me, Grisha, I'm going on the longest hike of my life. If I don't come back, take care of Masha. He never said anything like that before. Voron connected the dots. Semenov was being blackmailed over a large debt. He went on a trip with Arkady, who demanded confidentiality and paid double. The day before he left, he received an item wrapped in tarpaulin from an unknown person. Semenov left with it, knowing he might not return. So Semenov was carrying something that didn't belong to him, and that was valuable to Arkady, and it was kept secret from the whole group. Voron muttered, analyzing. The box they found buried was empty. There were no valuables in it, but the box had been broken into. Suddenly a thought flashed through Voron's mind, illuminating the whole picture. What could be taken from the tiger that was worth a lot of money, but wasn't gold, and couldn't be hidden in a small box? And why would that require an experienced guide who was forced to go against his own rules? Weapons, Raven muttered. Or something that can only be transported with human help. He returned to Petrov, who was waiting for him on the outskirts of the village. Petrov, check Arkady, not his accounts, his interests. Check the old deposits, and check Semenov to see if he was involved in smuggling before. And most importantly, what he could have received as collateral for going on this trip. While Petrov drove off with a sour look on his face to carry out the assignment, Voron headed back to Semenov's house. He couldn't understand why they would kill a guide who was himself interested in the successful completion of the expedition. He had to get out to pay off his debt, Voron reasoned as he examined the hut.
So something went wrong. Arkady got what he wanted. Or realized that Semenov would become too dangerous a witness. Ivan Andreevich examined the small shed where Semenov kept his equipment. It was clean and tidy.
And here, Shadow, who had been sitting quietly by the door, became alert. She began to sniff an old, dusty canister standing in the corner. "What is it, girl?" Raven crouched down. The Shadow whimpered and looked at her master.
"Not gasoline?" Raven opened the canister. It was empty, but it didn't smell like fuel, but salt. Salt crystals, usually used for salting meat and fish, lay at the bottom. And next to them was a small, rusty, but surprisingly familiar fragment.
It was the second, matching fragment of the broken can opener that Raven had found in the mud by the swamp. Semenov wasn't involved in smuggling. He was a hostage. He was threatened. So he took something with him on the trip to blackmail Arkady in return. But what? A pledge. Raven glanced at the salt. A pledge that is necessary for life in the taiga, and something that can be destroyed in case of failure. Voron suddenly realized what connected Arkady, the gold, the abandoned plots, and Semenov. There is something more valuable than gold in the taiga, and that something is information. And he understood what was wrapped in the tarpaulin. It was a map. A detailed old map of abandoned plots that Semenov carried as a guide. But it was valuable not for the trip, but for Arkady.
Semenov was blackmailed into taking Arkady to a specific place. But why break the knife and leave its pieces behind? Voron understood. Semenov, a man of his word, couldn't just run away. He left a note.
A note written on metal that could only be read by putting the two pieces of the knife together. A note that indicated the point of no return. The place where he was supposed to take Arkady, and where Semenov was trying to restore justice.
Voron left Semenov's house, leaving Maria in her quiet sorrow. Now he knew that Semenov was not a victim. He was a fighter who tried to leave behind the last, bitter truth. Now Raven's path lay back to the taiga, not following the traces of flight, but following the traces of the guide's revenge. He needed to find the place that Semenov had chosen for the final reckoning. The longest journey, Voron whispered. He knew he was following the trail of a man who could not escape his duty, but found a way not to escape his honor. Voron insisted that Major Petrov arrange an informal conversation with the survivors, one by one. Not in an office, where they would feel protected by the walls of the law, but in a neutral space, where they would be forced to talk about their feelings rather than facts. He knew that fear, once experienced, leaves jagged, torn edges in the memory, and any attempt to smooth them into a single, logical narrative creates a tension that is impossible to hide. First, Voron called Victor, the most emotional and broken of the three. The man sat, hugging a cup of tea, still trembling uncontrollably. Voron sat down opposite him, and Shadow, following an unspoken order, lay down in the corner like a silent, attentive judge. "Victor, we're not talking about Semenov," Raven began. "Tell me, when did you realize you were going to die?" The question was direct, sharp as an axe blow. Victor flinched, his eyes, swollen from insomnia, widened. "When? I don't know. When it started snowing? When we got lost?" "No, getting lost and wet is an inconvenience." Voron did not raise his voice, but each of his words sounded heavy and weighty. "Realizing that you are going to die is a moment.
It is not related to the weather, but to the person who was the first to stop sharing. Victor tried to look away, but Raven's gaze, heavy as that of a bird of prey, prevented him from doing so. We shared. Arkady wrote everything down, equally. Arkady wrote it down. Voron nodded. He knew that in survival situations, the more a person talks about fairness and protocols, the further they are from true morality. But which one of you or Arkady, drank more water? I drank more. I was more exhausted. I was the heaviest, Victor said defensively, revealing details that Arkady had omitted in his testimony. You were heavy even before the trip, but you became weaker later. Who lit the fire on the last night? I did. I mean, we both did. I gathered branches, Arkady. He made sure the fire didn't go out. He was very calm. Too calm. Voron found what he was looking for, a difference in perception. Victor saw Arkady as a source of support, a person who remained calm amid the chaos. But his subconscious was already screaming, too calm. Arkady created an aura of reliability around himself by exploiting Victor's fear. Victor said that before disappearing, Semenov had tried to give his knife to Victor, but he had refused to take it, fearing that Semenov would ask him to kill someone, or that he himself would lose control. This act of refusing the weapon was an act of refusing responsibility, and the Raven knew that Arkady had not missed this moment. Then Voron called Elena, the observer. She held herself much better than Victor. Her outward composure was almost flawless. Voron decided to attack her emotional armor. Elena, Victor is afraid. Arkady is angry. And you, what was the strongest feeling when you were left alone? Elena slowly looked at him, and for a second her eyes filled not with tears, but with disgust. Dirt, Ivan Andreevich. We were in such dirt. I thought I would never be able to wash it off. She focused on the most mundane and abstract. Dirt can be washed off. What can't? Voron didn't let her stray from the topic. Semenov was yelling about the swamp. Do you remember what Arkady looked like when Semenov was yelling? Arkady, he tried to calm him down. He was the only one who kept his composure. You looked at him because he was your support, but you were afraid of him. Not that he would lose control. You were afraid that he would make a decision. Elena flinched. Voron had hit the nail on the head. He knew that when fear becomes universal, people look for a leader. And if the leader doesn't panic, they see him not as a savior, but as a potential tyrant. He looked at us as if we were obstacles. Elena whispered. He started saying that only the strongest should survive. He said that Semenov was dead weight because his psychology couldn't handle it. He used very clever words, and we were too hungry to argue. Voron understood. Arkady had psychologically prepared them to eliminate Semenov. He had hammered into Victor and Elena's heads the idea that the conductor's panic was inevitable, and that his death was natural selection. This explained their pure lie. They believed Arkady's version because it gave them moral justification. Their story was pure because they considered themselves forced victims, and Arkady, a forced hero. After talking to Elena,
Voron was ready for the final confrontation with Arkady. The cold-blooded was waiting for him.
He was dressed in clean, fresh clothes and smelled of expensive cologne. He was ostentatiously reading a book. He was ready for battle, and it was evident from the way he held his back.
You recovered very quickly, Arkady. Voron sat down, and his gaze became even heavier. I didn't cry or scream, Ivan Andreevich. I'm a man of action. I focused on the fact that we had been found. And I hope you find Semenov so that the charges of panic can be dropped.
Drop the charges? You are the most merciful of all. Don't you think that's strange? Voron didn't mention the ring or the tracks. He decided to talk about feelings.
Tell me, how did you feel when your fourth comrade died? Arkady lowered his eyes for a second.
Grief. But I understood that in nature it's natural. His body couldn't take it. Natural.
And how did you feel when you found those food scraps in Semenov's backpack that you lied about? Arkady raised his head, his eyes empty, but Raven saw alarm flash in them. This was the first time Raven had struck at their alibi.
You're wrong. There was no food. We ate everything down to the last crumb on the 6th day.
What about the chipmunk bones in the ashes? Who ate them?
Arkady tried to smile. The smile came out crooked. It was probably Semenov.
I'm telling you, he went crazy. He became like an animal.
No, Arkady. Voron leaned forward. You ate them. You were cold-blooded enough to eat them alone, without sharing. You were the strongest, which meant you had more rights.
You used your mind to survive, and your will to make the others believe your version of the truth. Arkady put the book down, his face turning to ice.
You're playing mind games, Ivan Andreevich. You have no evidence.
The three of us have consistent testimony. You have a perfect alibi. You used panic as a cover. But panic, Arkady, is disorderly movement. And your steps were steady. Too steady for someone who had just gone through hell.
Your tracks in the tiger are the tracks of control. You weren't afraid. You were waiting for your moment to become the sole leader. Voron ended the interrogation. He knew that Arkady would not break under words.
He needed physical evidence that Semenov had been taken away, and that it was not only a struggle for life, but something brought in from outside, something that was wrapped in tarpaulin. Ivan Andreevich left the hotel.
The city atmosphere was suffocating him. He called Petrov. Arkady is our man. He killed Semenov to take the cargo and control. Now we need the trail he took. Look for traces of the gun. Voron knew that he had to return to where, in his opinion, the real Semenov had begun his last game. He had to find the trail that led nowhere. The trail that Arkady had created to cover the traces of his cold-blooded greed.
He felt that the truth awaited him where the forest gave way to impenetrable dark thickets,
And where human morality finally dissolved into the peat haze, receiving a dry, bureaucratic response from Petrov.
Arkady is clean. No debts. Tourist. Investor. Went to inspect abandoned mines. Voron only smiled grimly. For urban systems, Arkady was ideal. But for the tiger, he was a predator, lurking in the wool of a sheep. There was no information about collateral or a map, but Voron trusted not papers, but his own internal logic. Semenov did not run away. He tried to bargain, and he lost. Ivan Andreevich knew that, For definitive proof, he had to find something physical that would link Arkady to the violence, but that would not look like obvious evidence that the police would notice. He remembered how Arkady held his hands when they talked, unnaturally clenched. Voron returned to the investigator and demanded the medical examination data of the survivors, taken immediately after the evacuation. Petrov sighed heavily and took out the folders, not understanding why his experienced consultant needed the paperwork. "I'm looking for cuts, Petrov. Bruises. Traces of a struggle," Voron explained without looking up. "Not the kind caused by branches or falls. The kind left by a person. Victor and Elena have bruises and scratches, the result of panic. Arkady has only a small cut on his forearm. The doctor attributed it to a branch." A minor scratch. Voron felt a string tense inside him. A scratch. He carefully studied the description of the wound. A shallow, straight, clean, soft tissue injury, about 2 centimeters long, on the inside of the left forearm. Heals quickly. A hunter and a man of the taiga knows the value of every wound. When a person falls or scrambles through bushes in a panic, the wounds are always jagged, dirty, multiple, and chaotic. They are located on the outside of the arms, legs, and face. But a clean, straight cut on the inside of the forearm? That's not a branch. It's the result of a precise, directed movement. With a branch, Arkady, you could have gotten a laceration on the outside while protecting your face. But inside, Petrov, you only get wounded like that in one case. When you try to hold on to a weapon or block a blow. Voron emphasized the last word, his gaze hardening. This isn't the wound of a panicker. It's the wound of a fighter. Voron knew that this cut was left by a knife. Not Arkady's knife, which was probably carefully hidden, but Semenov's knife. Recalling Victor's testimony that Semenov had tried to give him the knife, Voron pieced together the picture. The guide, realizing that he had been betrayed and deprived of his chance, decided to resist, but his attempt was suppressed in the most cold-blooded manner. The moment of conflict. Semenov, already wounded or disarmed, but still in possession of his personal hunting knife, tried to use it against Arkady. Arkady, who had been demonstrating a cool head in the camp, was actually ready. He did not panic. He was focused. He blocked the blow, or tried to wrestle the knife away, receiving a clean, straight cut. A panicked person with such a wound would have howled in pain, but Arkady probably did not even show it. Arkady wasn't exhausted. Arkady was in control of himself. Voron tapped his finger on the note about the cut. He wasn't the least bit affected by hunger. He was the most prepared for it. All his calm demeanor in the camp, his notes about justice, his talk about survival of the fittest, it was all a prelude. He knew that Semenov would become a threat as soon as the supplies ran out. And when Semenov realized that Arkady simply wanted to eliminate him, he rushed into a fight. Voron realized that Arkady controlled not only resources, but also information. He was the one who removed the evidence, who dictated the version of events to Elena and Victor. And his composure, which they mistook for heroism, was in fact psychopathic indifference. Who was he with? Voron suddenly asked, remembering that Arkady had arrived in a group of 4 tourists. We know about Victor, Elena, the deceased, and Arkady. Who was the deceased? Maslov, 40 years old, hypothermia. He had no debts, and was Arkady's partner in some investment firm. Voron looked at Elena's testimony.
Arkady and Maslov had become very close in recent days.
Maslov was an accomplice, Petrov, not in the murder, but in the purpose of the trip.
Look. Voron pointed to the description of Maslov's lacerations. He has the worst wounds of all. He was completely emaciated. He wasn't cold-blooded. He was dependent on Arkady.
Voron saw the whole picture. Arkady and Maslov, his investment partner, forced Semenov to lead them to the abandoned mines.
The guarantee that Semenov would not reveal the purpose of the trip was the map and, possibly, his wife's life.
In the taiga, when hunger set in, Maslov, who was physically weaker, became a burden, and Semenov became a hindrance.
Arkady, being the most cold-blooded, eliminated Semenov by staging his panic, and then calmly waited for his accomplice Maslov to die of natural causes, so as not to share the loot or information with him. He killed Semenov because he was an obstacle. And he killed Maslov because he became a witness and an extra mouth to feed. Concluded Voron.
And Victor and Elena are the perfect victims who believe his lies.
Ivan Andreevich returned to the map that Petrov had left on the table. He traced his finger from the camp to the very path along which, he assumed, Semenov had been taken.
If Arkady killed Semenov for the knife, it was a close-quarters fight. But he had to be neutralized so he wouldn't raise the alarm. And he had to be carried away from the trail. Voron picked up the pieces of the can opener found near the swamp and in Semenov's shed. He knew that even under a layer of rust, it was possible to scratch out a word on metal. Semenov, a man who did not trust city laws, had left his own brand of justice behind. Arkady didn't just survive. He won the game of survival because he played not by the rules of nature, but by the rules of greed, Voron whispered.
Now Voron had no choice but to return to the taiga. He knew that if Semenov had left a note, it would indicate a place where Semenov was supposed to take Arkady, and where Semenov tried to get rid of him. Voron had to find that place. He knew that the darkest discovery awaited him. He had to find the trail that leads nowhere, the trail that Arkady had created to hide his true prey, and the place where the last trace of the guide was located.
The Raven found himself back at the edge of the Semenov swamp. But this time he was looking not for traces of panic, but for its source. He ignored the fake trail that Arkady had created as a diversion and headed in the direction where, according to the logic of the taiga dweller, Semenov, no sane person would go.
It was there, where all reasonable paths ended, that Raven expected to find the truth. The shadow walked beside him, its low, growling whimper confirming that it sensed something wrong here, something alien to the forest.
Laika led Voron, not by human tracks, but by the faint scent of sweat, fear, and metal that could not belong to the guide. They went deeper into the thicket, where the ground was denser but covered with a thick layer of moss and fallen pine needles.
Arkady had chosen this spot perfectly. It masked any footprints, but was far enough from the camp that cries for help would not reach other tourists. The Raven moved like a ghost, his gaze sliding over the tree trunks. He was not looking for footprints, but for signs of a struggle. Broken branches at waist level, unusual scratches on the bark, imprints of something heavy.
He understood that Semenov could not have been killed immediately. He was too strong to simply give up.
And then, at the foot of an old spreading cedar tree, the shadow stopped and began to scratch the ground furiously, making a low, hunting sound.
Raven crouched down. Here, among the moss and tough grass, was a real crime scene, which had been camouflaged with devilish precision. At first glance,
It looked like an ordinary fallen tree.
But Raven noticed that the branches had been arranged unnaturally, deliberately, to hide a small but distinct bald spot in the moss. He carefully removed the branches. Underneath was a trampled area where the earth had been shifted and compacted.
Too much movement for a simple rest stop. This was the place where Semenova had been neutralized. Voron began to read the area.
He discovered several details. First, a deep, jagged heel print that belonged to Semenov's shoe, but was positioned unnaturally, as if he had tried to push off when he was knocked down. Second, a small puddle of fresh blood under a layer of moss.
Raven carefully took some blood on his finger. It was fresh. It wasn't Semenov's blood. It was human blood, left there recently. Probably Arkady's blood, from the knife cut Semenov lied about when talking about the branch.
Third, and most important, on the bark of a cedar tree, about a meter above the ground, Voron found a rifle butt mark. It was not deep or obvious, as if the butt had been leaned against the tree for a second. It was not the mark of a hunting rifle, but of something more massive, with a wide stock, possibly a rifle with optics or a carbine. A rifle that tourists were not supposed to carry with them. Voron stood up. He pieced together the picture. Semenov resisted. They knocked him down, and Arkady, or perhaps Maslov, while he was still alive, was stabbed, but managed to immobilize the guide with a weapon. He wasn't killed here.
He was taken away, concluded Voron. There was a rifle, not for hunting, for control. Shadow, following his train of thought, led Voron away from the camp, along a barely visible trail. It was an old, almost forgotten trail, known only to locals. Semenov was supposed to use it to reach civilization, but Arkady forced him to turn back. After walking about a kilometer, Raven discovered drag marks. They weren't straight, but zigzagged between the trees, as if someone had been dragging a heavy, immobile load. Next to the drag marks were clear but cautious footprints of two people. Arkady, and apparently Maslov, who was still alive. They tried to hide the drag marks by covering them with leaves, but the drag left deep, unnatural furrows in the moss. "This isn't panic," Voron whispered. "This is hard work covering up tracks." Ivan Andreevich knew that Semyonov was wounded and disarmed, but alive. But why drag a living person? There was only one answer. Semyonov had to lead them somewhere. Voron remembered Semyonov's wife saying that he had taken something with him, wrapped in canvas, a map, and Uncle Grisha's words about a man who was used to giving orders. Arkady, the investor, wasn't there for the scenery. He was there for the treasure. And Semenov was the only one who knew the way to it. Voron followed the drag marks, which wound like snakes through the windbreak. The path, which he called the path that leads nowhere, was just that. It led to a remote, impassable section of the forest where no one would go just for the sake of it. Soon the drag marks ended at a small but deep river that was not marked on the map. Raven stopped. Here, on the bank, were fresh traces of a fire. A small, neat fire that had been lit not for warmth, but for light. They stopped here. Raven ran his hand over the sand to look at the map. On the bank, right by the water, Shadow found a crumpled piece of paper. The paper was damp, but the lines were clearly visible. It was a fragment of a map. Not an ordinary one, but an old one,
with notes and coordinates written in pencil. Semenov must have managed to tear off a piece of the map during the fight, or during a break to destroy it, or use it as a last clue. But why did they need a gun? A map doesn't fight back. Voron understood. Semenov, being blackmailed, knew that Arkady would not let him go alive. He knew that death awaited him, and he would not just give up the map. He could have hidden the key element of the treasure, and Arkady dragged him along to find out the location.
The gun was for interrogation, Petrov, Voron whispered, not for murder, for torture.
Voron looked at the river. It was shallow but fast-flowing. Arkady and Maslov, having obtained the information they needed, had to get rid of the guide. They wouldn't have dragged him back. They most likely drowned him here, so that the body would be carried away by the current and not found. But Voron found no traces to confirm this version. The shadow suddenly whimpered and looked not at the water, but at the opposite bank. "Is he gone, girl?" Raven asked. They crossed the river. On the opposite bank, in thick clay, Raven found what he was looking for: a double trail. Semenov's trail and Arkady's trail. Semenov, clearly wounded, was walking, leaning on Arkady, who was leading him. But where? Ivan Andreevich looked up and saw in the distance, high in the mountains, a barely noticeable, weathered stone formation, resembling a stone eagle. This place was known only to the oldest taiga dwellers. It was a place where tourists did not go. Voron understood. Semenov had not been killed here. He went on. He could not escape his duty and blackmail, but he found a way not to escape his honor. He led Arkady to the final destination. "The trail leads nowhere, Petrov. It leads to justice," said Voron. "And where there is justice, there will be his body." Voron moved upward, toward the stone eagle. He knew he was following a trail that Semenov had left, not for salvation, but for retribution. A place awaited him where civilization ended and true, wild, but just retribution began. Climbing the slope that led to the stone eagle, Raven reconstructed not just events, but logic. He discarded human laws, focusing on the only thing that mattered in the wild: necessity. Semenov's murder was not an act of blind rage. It was a calculated necessity. The philosophy of the taiga is simple. An extra mouth to feed is a threat to everyone. But the guide, Semenov, was not an extra mouth to feed. He was the key to salvation. Eliminating him while the group was on the brink of destruction was not panic. It was a calculated move aimed at gaining complete control. Voron knew that his main antagonist, Arkady, was a cold-blooded type who did not break down, but adapted to hunger and cold. He did not just survive. He used the crisis as a social purge. Semenov was the only person who knew the taiga, and who could stand up to Arkady, both in terms of knowledge of the area and moral authority. By eliminating him, Arkady automatically became the new leader, and Victor and Elena became his loyal followers, completely dependent on his calmness. The plot of the murder took shape in Voron's mind like a clear picture. Arkady and Maslov, before his death, were carrying something valuable that had to do with the abandoned mines. Semenov, blackmailed by debts, was forced to lead them. When the provisions ran out, Semenov realized that Arkady, having obtained the map or information, would simply eliminate him so as not to share the treasure and to get rid of the witness. Semenov tried to resist, using his knife, which left Arkady with a cut. But the gun that Arkady had brought with him under the guise of a canvas bundle decided the outcome of the fight. Semenov was disarmed, his satellite phone was crushed, and he himself, wounded,
was forced to continue on to the final destination, where the main prize lay. Ivan Andreevich slowed his pace.
He found the place where Semenov and Arkady, now without Maslov, had stopped for a final rest. It was a small rock niche. There were clear footprints on the ground. Semenov leaned against the cold stone, his footprints deep, while Arkady stood opposite him, his footprints light and relaxed. Arkady was not exhausted. He was waiting. Here, Voron found another clue, in a crack in the rock, where moisture and dirt had accidentally accumulated. Voron discovered a crumpled cigarette butt. Not just any cigarette, but an expensive, imported one, which Semenov definitely did not smoke. Arkady was not nervous. He enjoyed the moment of control. Not shy about smoking in front of the dying guide, who could not even build a fire. It was an act of demonstrating power, the final humiliation. He didn't just survive. Voron muttered, his voice dry with inner rage. He feasted on the bones of others. But why did Semenov leave with Arkady? He could have tried to escape. Voron understood. Semenov was not running for salvation. He was leading Arkady down a false path that seemed right at first glance, but ended in a dead end. The path leading to the Stone Eagle was the most difficult, but it was the shortest to the abandoned mines. Semenov, a man of honor, could not give what he considered to be national treasure, information about the mines, into the hands of the greedy Arkady. He led Arkady to the point of no return, but he did so in order to destroy Arkady's last hope of quick riches. Voron looked up. They had reached the foot of the Stone Eagle. It was a high, barren plateau where the wind blew constantly and there was nowhere to hide. It was here, on this cold, lifeless plateau, that Semenov must have realized that his last game was lost. But he played it to the end. Suddenly, the shadow, which had been walking quietly until then, broke away and rushed forward, letting out a piercing, mournful howl that carried across the mountain plateau like a silent sentence. The raven followed it. In a hollow between two rocks, overgrown with tough, dead shrubs, he saw what he was looking for. Anatoly Semenov. He lay motionless, covered by a carelessly thrown tarpaulin, the same one in which, according to Uncle Grisha, the rifle had been brought. His posture was unnatural, as if he were trying to protect something by pressing it to his chest. Voron bent over the body, feeling a quiet, deep sadness wash over him. There were signs of a beating on Semenov's body, but no bullet wounds. The murder had been committed with a blunt object, a strong blow to the head, or, more likely, a blow with the butt of a rifle. This was consistent with Arkady's logic. Avoid bullets so that he could not be accused of murder. Death that could be attributed to a fall or an accident. But the most important thing was what Semenov was clutching to his chest. It wasn't a map. It was a diary. A thin, worn book with a leather cover. Voron carefully took it. On the last page of the diary, written in Semenov's uneven, almost unrecognizable handwriting, was the final, bitter truth. He got what he wanted. I brought him here. But he didn't find what he was looking for. I destroyed the most important thing. I lost my life, but not my honor. And he is not a survivor. He is a murderer. And he will return soon. My blood is on him. I left it where we were seen. He took my knife, He thinks he has won. But the tiger does not forgive lies.
It waits for its raven.
The raven clutched the diary. Semenov was not just a victim. He was the last guide who left a trail, not for salvation, but for accusation. He knew that Arkady would return for the treasure he had destroyed,
And Semenov left his killer with the conviction that he had covered all his tracks. But what had he destroyed? What was more valuable than money? The raven raised his head, looked at the stone eagle, and realized that Semenov had not given Arkady the most important thing, the starting point. Now Voron had to leave the taiga. He had found the body. He had found the evidence. Now he had to find the weapon and force Arkady to confess, using not the law, but the truth of the taiga. "You lost, Arkady," the raven whispered, "and now the hunt begins. And in this game, you are not the guide. You are the prey." He turned around. His path lay back to the world he despised so much. But where now his natural justice, the raven's justice, had to be done? After discovering Semenov's body and his deathbed diary, Voron did not call Petrov immediately. First, he carefully camouflaged the site so that it would not be found prematurely. He hid the diary under his clothes, realizing that it was not just evidence, but the conductor's philosophical testament, and it must not fall into the hands of the police before Arkady was caught in the trap. The return to civilization was quick and gloomy. Voron had no doubt that during his absence, Arkady, feeling the noose tightening, would take countermeasures. And so it happened. Major Petrov greeted Voron with a face full of fatigue and irritation, not even bothering to say hello. "You disappear into your taiga, and now there's a whole storm here, Ivan Andreevich." "Arkady?" "That's right, him and Elena. Victor is having a nervous breakdown. He won't talk to anyone. But these two, they filed an official complaint." Arkady, acting with the same cold logic as in the tiger, struck a preemptive blow. Using his clean image as an impeccable investor and survivor hero, he accused Voron of psychological pressure, threats, and falsification of data. He said that you are, and I quote, "an old resentful nature reserve, obsessed with revenge for your lost position." Petrov ran his hand through his hair in irritation. He said you pointed a gun at him, demanded a confession to something that didn't happen, and that the cut on his arm was from your careless demonstration with a knife. And what did Elena say? Elena backed him up. She said, "You scared her with your taiga mystical theories about hunger and morality." She was convincing, Vanya. Tears, a trembling voice. The perfect victim. Voron listened without blinking. Arkady was a genius at substitution. He took the most dangerous evidence against himself, the pressure and the cut, and turned it around, pinning those sins on Voron. He used the mysticism of the taiga and the image of the wronged Voron as the perfect shield. Arkady now has his own personal lawyer, a very expensive one. They are demanding that you be removed. Tomorrow morning, an inspection team will arrive from the region. Let them demand it. It only confirms that he is afraid. Voron placed 2 pieces of a can opener found in the swamp and in Semyonov's shed on the table. Put them together, Petrov. Find a specialist
who can read what is scratched there.
It will be a letter from Semenov.
Petrov shook his head wearily. It's old metal, Vanya, rust. We won't be able to prove it. It's just your taiga speculation again. And while you're searching here, Arkady is covering his tracks.
He's already flown back to the taiga. Where? Voron tensed instantly. He said he needed to personally honor the memory of his deceased friend, Maslov, who died of hypothermia, and collect their abandoned belongings. That is, his backpack and the rifle. He said he found the rifle with the group and now fears it will fall into the hands of poachers.
Voron understood. Arkady didn't know about the diary.
He thought that the main piece of evidence against him was the rifle he had used to intimidate Semenov. And he was returning to find the rifle and retrieve the treasure, the location of which, in his opinion, Semenov had revealed before his death.
He's going to the Stone Eagle, Petrov. Voron took his hiking jacket. He thinks Semenov showed him the way to the mines, and he knows that his friend Maslov's body will be found, but Semenov's body must disappear.
He's going for the gun and to drown Semenov's body in the deepest bog.
You can't go! You don't have the authority! And he's officially taking his property!
Petrov tried to stop him, but Raven was already moving toward the exit. My authority, Petrov, ends where his lies begin. And you won't be able to arrest him until I find his gun and his ring there in the mud. Voron didn't waste time packing. He took only his binoculars, a knife, and shadow. He couldn't wait for the official team, which would arrive too late. This was a hunt. Arkady was smart and cold-blooded, but he was a city predator, and Raven was a predator of the taiga. And in his world, the rules were set not by lawyers, but by nature itself. He thinks I'll be looking for clues in the ground, Raven muttered, getting into his UAZ and leaving Petrov in the state of nervous collapse. But I'll look for his mistake. Cool-headedness is not the absence of fear. It's a disguise, and I'll find the crack through which his fear will come out. Voron knew that Arkady was now hunting him. Arkady had most likely taken a weapon with him and would be waiting for his arrival. It was a game of survival, but this time with different stakes. Raven had to not only find the truth, but also ensure justice. Justice based on the code of the taiga, which did not forgive greed and imbalance. He drove his car along the broken road, his gaze focused. Before him was not a trail, but a battlefield. Arkady thought he had killed the only guide. But he forgot that in the taiga there is always a second one. One who sees not with his eyes, but with the soul of the forest. And this second one, Raven, was already on his trail. He knew that the final battle would take place at the foot of the Stone Eagle, and only there could the last trace of the guide be found. Voron rushed back into the taiga, his UAZ roaring over the broken roads, but unlike Arkady, he was not afraid. In his hands was Semenov's diary. A quiet but deadly sentence. And he knew that this was the only thing that could break the cold-blooded killer. Arkady, who had flown out in a private helicopter, was supposed to arrive at the camp before Voron. He planned to quickly retrieve the hidden gun and treasure, and then return to Semenov to drown his body, finally confirming the version of a panic escape. But Voron knew that he was not waiting for him at the swamp, but at the Stone Eagle. Ivan Andreevich and the Shadow walked straight ahead, ignoring the trails, relying on Semenov's sense of the forest and knowledge, which Voron now felt as his own. When they came out onto the bare, windy plateau at the Stone Eagle, the sun was already setting, painting the rocks crimson.
Voron immediately sensed a foreign presence. Arkady was here.
He was not hiding, but he was not showing himself either. Confident in his advantage, he was armed, and Voron was not. Raven slowly approached the rock niche where he had found the body the day before. Semenov's body was gone. The tarpaulin that had covered it had been carelessly thrown aside. Too late, Raven whispered. He took him. He examined the niche.
Arkady was looking for the treasure that, according to his calculations, Semenov should have hidden here, but apparently found nothing except the diary that Raven had taken first. Arkady rummaged through the rocks, as evidenced by the displaced moss and knocked down clay. His greed was stronger than his caution.
Following his instincts, the shadow led Voron to a small crevice overgrown with bushes, which Voron had not noticed the day before. The crevice was narrow and deep, and it was dark there.
The gun, Raven stated.
He knew that Arkady, having found no treasure and seeing that Semenov's body had disappeared, had decided to first get rid of the gun, the most dangerous piece of evidence, which he could not blame on panic. Voron did not climb into the crevice. He crouched down and began to feel around the bottom with a long branch. Soon he felt the hard, cold touch of metal. He pulled out the rifle. It was an expensive hunting carbine with optics, not registered in the area.
On the stock was a clear, deep imprint that matched perfectly with the imprint on the cedar bark that Raven had found. Nearby, just above the rifle, in a narrow crevice, he felt something else, something round and metallic.
It was a wedding ring, an expensive gold ring, with a small but distinctive notch which apparently belonged to Arkady.
Raven remembered the ring, the imprint of which he had found on the bark of a fir tree near the camp.
Arkady, a cold-blooded predator, who used foot ointment and carefully controlled his emotions, could not allow his precious possession, brought from his clean world, to disappear.
He took it off when he realized he would have to work in the dirt, and then, in a hurry, simply forgot about it.
There you are, Arkady.
Raven clenched the ring in his hand.
You forgot your civilization.
Suddenly, there was a dry, sharp crack of a breaking branch behind them. Raven, moving at a speed no one would expect from a 48-year-old man, instantly jumped behind a cedar tree, dragging Shadow with him.
I knew you would come, Raven.
Arkady's sharp, angry voice rang out. His cool facade collapsed, leaving pure, undisguised malice.
You have no right to interfere. Go away. You're too late. I took the body.
I'll drown it, and you won't be able to prove anything. Arkady emerged from behind the rock. He was armed with Semenov's knife.
It was an old hunting knife that Arkady had taken as a trophy and, perhaps, as proof that the guide had been armed when he went mad. Arkady, not finding the treasure or the gun, realized that Voron had beaten him to it and was now ready for an open
confrontation.
Semenov didn't run away, Arkady. Voron came out from behind the tree, his hands empty. You killed him with a blow from the butt of your rifle. You got cut by his knife because he was defending himself. And you lied about the food and the panic.
He went mad with hunger. He attacked me. I was defending myself.
Arkady shouted, but there was a false, strained note in his voice. He was trying to return to his clean version.
You were defending yourself.
Voron slowly raised his hand, showing the ring. Who were you defending yourself from, Arkady? From hunger? From the cold? No. You were defending yourself from a witness. And you forgot your little, precious symbol.
You hid it when you realized you'd have to get your hands dirty.
Arkady froze. His gaze was fixed on the ring. This simple object brought from his world was much more frightening to him than a gun or a body.
It was the undeniable truth about his intent. You're not just a murderer, Arkady. You're a weak predator. You use the weakness of others as your strength, Voron said calmly. But his words were heavy. And you thought Semenov would just drown.
But he left you a letter. Voron took out Semenov's diary. He didn't give you the treasure. He destroyed it. And he waited for me to come.
Because the tiger does not forgive those who disturb its balance. Arkady, blinded by panic that his clean game was over, jerked. He lunged at Raven with a knife, forgetting that he was not facing a frightened tourist, but a man carved from stone.
The shadow reacted instantly, its low growl turning into a battle snarl.
Voron, without using physical force, dodged the blow with a single movement, and Arkady, miscalculating his momentum, stumbled over a rock, hitting his hand against a cedar trunk, and Semenov's knife flew away.
Justice has caught up with you, Arkady, said Voron, watching as the killer, now completely broken, tried to catch his breath. Voron raised his rifle.
He had found not only the body, but also the murder weapon, and most importantly, personal evidence that completely destroyed the panic escape theory. Now he could return to Petrov's world. But first, he needed to restore order.
Semenov's body is lying where you left it, Arkady. And you will show me that place, said Voron. And then you will be punished, not according to human law, according to the law of the taiga. Arkady, his face contorted with despair, realized that his ideal scenario was over. He had been caught, not by the police, but by nature. Voron returned to the city, but not to the police station, but straight to the hotel where Arkady was waiting for his flight, surrounded by lawyers and an aura of infallible purity. Ivan Andreevich did not need warrants or sanctions.
He carried with him the verdict handed down by the tiger itself, and that was enough. He knew that Arkady, deprived of his gun and ring, was already morally broken.
Arkady's lawyer tried to block Voron's path, talking about immunity and procedural norms. Voron did not even look up at him.
His gaze, heavy and calm, passed through the city defender as if through transparent glass, and focused on Arkady, who sat in the corner with perfect posture, trying to portray a bored but offended man.
You killed Semenov, Arkady, Voron said.
His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was a power in it that made Victor, sitting next to him, flinch. And you thought everything was covered up. Voron did not go into the details of the evidence. He started from the beginning, with the chronology of fear that Arkady had so carefully hidden. You lied from day one. Your trail was too smooth. You conserved your strength while the others wasted theirs. You knew you would be the only one to survive, and you waited for your comrade, Maslov, to die a natural death, so you wouldn't have to share the treasure with him. That's not survival. That's calculation.
Arkady tried to keep up his act.
This is nonsense. These are your taiga speculations, Ivan Andreevich. My lawyers. Your lawyer wasn't in the taiga. But I was. And I found what you left behind. Voron held out his hand, showing the wedding ring.
It glinted in the artificial light of the hotel, like a symbol of betrayal. This isn't just a ring, Arkady. It's a trace of your intent. You took it off because you knew you'd have to get your hands dirty with blood and mud, and you didn't want your clean world
to mix with your animal nature. You planned it. Arkady turned pale.
The ring was not evidence for the court, but a verdict on his conscience. He had always believed that he was in control of everything. But this small object proved that his composure was just a mask that slipped at a critical moment.
Voron moved on to the essence of the crime, using the evidence he had found to confirm his knowledge. Semenov didn't run away. You blackmailed him with his debt so that he would lead you to the abandoned mines. You brought a rifle to force him to obey. And when you realized that Semenov would not give you the main secret, the map, which he destroyed, you hit him with the butt of the rifle. Not with a shot, with a blow that could be written off as an accidental fall. He took out Semenov's diary. And this is the last guide. He couldn't save himself, but he saved the truth. He left a note calling you a murderer and pointing out where he led you on a false trail. He led you to the Stone Eagle, to a dead end where you would realize there was no prey. He forced you to drag his wounded body so that you would feel the weight of your crime. The Raven put the diary on the table. And then you came back to drown the body and take the rifle so that there would be no murder weapon left.
But I found it too. And I found where you threw Semenov's body. Suddenly Elena, who had been sitting motionless like a statue, jumped up, her face contorted with horror. He spoke! He said that Semenov had gone mad. He made us say that.
He said we had to stick to one version. Otherwise, we would be accused ourselves. Elena, the observer, finally broke down. Her composure was not her own, but imposed on her by Arkady. She was not an accomplice. She was a frightened victim.
Victor, hearing the truth, began to cry. But these were no longer tears of panic, but tears of atonement.
He scared me. He said he had a gun.
He said we would all die if we didn't do as he said.
The climax came not in a shootout, but in the exposure of the lie. Arkady's perfect facade collapsed. He lost control over his accomplices, and most importantly, over his story. Arkady looked at the ring, the diary, and the trembling faces of Elena and Victor. He realized that Voron was the only one who had seen his true motivation. Not just to survive, but to enrich himself at the expense of other people's lives and land. I just wanted to get what was rightfully mine, Arkady whispered, his voice filled with genuine, animalistic despair. In the taiga, only the strongest survive. The honest survive, Arkady. Voron corrected him. And you were a weak, sick individual who upset the balance. The outcome was quick.
The lawyer, seeing how the clean version had collapsed and hearing the testimony of Elena and Victor, who had already begun to give confused but truthful testimony about the gun and the threats, stepped aside.
Petrov, who had come to the hotel anticipating a scandal, stood in the doorway, looking at the ring and the rifle. He saw that Voron had restored order, using methods that were not prescribed in any charter. Arkady, deprived of his alibi, broke down. He did not resist when Petrov handcuffed him. He finally realized that he had lost the game not to the investigator, but to the man of the taiga. His purity and composure turned out to be filth. "Where is the body, Arkady?" Voron asked quietly.
There, where I left it. In a deep pit, 300 meters from the Eagle. I couldn't drown it.
I couldn't drag it to the swamp. Voron nodded. He didn't need loud words. Justice had been done.
He had restored the balance that the greedy man had disrupted.
The urban commotion surrounding the case of the last conductor quickly subsided, replaced by the stern, cold silence of the official investigation.
The police, finally having obtained physical evidence, a carbine with characteristic damage to the stock, Arkady's ring found near the crevice, and Semenov's diary, confirmed by handwriting analysis, quickly closed the case.
Arkady, deprived of his clean image and legal defense, broke down completely. He showed where he had hidden Semenov's body and confessed to the murder, trying to shift the blame onto the deceased Maslov.
But Voron's logic, based on clues and survival psychology, was irrefutable. He uncovered not murder, but betrayal. Elena and Victor, finally freed from fear, became important witnesses, confirming how Arkady systematically pressured them, using hunger and fear as weapons. Major Petrov stood outside the hotel, where neither Arkady nor the bustling lawyers were to be found, and simply looked at Ivan Andreevich. His gaze was a mixture of professional irritation and quiet, unspoken respect. He knew that Voron had once again done the job that his entire system had failed to do.
"Thank you, Ivan Andreevich," Petrov said in a formal but hollow voice. "You were right. From the very beginning."
The testimony was too clean. Tiger doesn't lie, Petrov. Voron did not accept the thanks. He simply stated a fact. And you're too used to trusting clean papers rather than dirty truth. What about the treasure?
The mines?
Nothing, Voron shook his head. Semenov destroyed what Arkady was after. He destroyed the reference point. A map without coordinates is just a piece of paper. The money rotted in the ground. It's ironic, Petrov. Arkady killed a man for nothing. For greed that turned out to be empty. Ivan Andreevich returned to his old oise, casting one last heavy glance at Petrov. That glance contained the same contempt for city laws that had never disappeared. But there was also a faint, barely noticeable hint of recognition. Order had been restored. Voron drove away, heading not for his distant winter hut, but for Semenov's house. He did not go to Maria, his wife. He left Semenov's diary, rolled up into a tube, on the stone steps at the door of her house. Next to it, he placed his hunting knife. The knife he carried with him because he knew that justice sometimes requires not just a trial, but a symbol. The diary was the truth about Semenov's honor, and the knife was silent testimony to his struggle. It was an act of atonement, not before the law, but before the spirit of the taiga. He reached his clearing when the sun had almost set, and the forest was plunged into thick blue darkness. He entered the winter hut. The smell of pine needles, smoke, and dry earth instantly enveloped him, washing away the smells of the city, lies, and other people's fear. The shadow lay quietly by the fire. Ivan Andreevich sat down on his cedar stump. He took out his old hunting knife and began to clean it. It was his ritual. Voron's philosophy was simple. Crime was a violation of the natural order, and his job was to put everything back in its place. Arkady was a sick individual who needed to be removed from the ecosystem. Now he was gone. He stared at the flames and thought about Semenov. The guide had not run away. He had died, defending his honor and his land from greed. He had committed an act of supreme justice.
He had not allowed evil to triumph, even at the cost of his own life. He had been the last guide, but his death had shown the way to truth.
For Voron, justice had nothing to do with prisons or articles of the criminal code. It had to do with balance. Now the balance had been restored. The tiger had taken back its son Semenov and got rid of the foreign element, Arkady.
Voron finished cleaning his knife. His gaze, heavy, calm, incredibly attentive, Voron's gaze was once again directed at the world. There was neither the joy of victory nor the bitterness of defeat. There was only the quiet sadness of conscious truth and the deep philosophical understanding that life and death are just two sides of the same eternal process. He knew that the taiga would wait for him. It always waits, because there will always be someone who will try to break its laws, to bring their own selfish and petty justice to it. And then it will need Raven again. A man who does not seek revenge, but seeks order. Ivan Andreevich put down the knife. He stroked Shadow's head. Night fell on the forest. The silence of the taiga reigned. Deep, cold, and absolutely honest. "Sleep, girl," he whispered. "Order has been restored." He closed his eyes. Ahead of him lay only the taiga and its eternal, unbreakable calm.